The following program originally appeared on Tor.com and is being resyndicated here by IO9.
Welcome to the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Hosted by John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 4 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today we'll be talking with author Marjorie M. Liu, author of the Dirk and Steel series and the Hunter Kiss series. She also writes comic books for Marvel Comics, the Dark Wolverine and NYX. So in this interview I found, they asked her, what did you want to be when you grew up? And she says, an astronaut, an Egyptologist, an archaeologist, namely Indiana Jones, starship pilot, doctor, folklorist, a female Magnum PI, race car driver, the human sidekick to Optimus Prime, and a Jedi Knight. Which I think may actually be the most awesome thing I've ever heard. So I'm really looking forward to this interview.
What did you want to be when you grew up, Dave? I mean, when you grow up, I should say, because you obviously haven't grown up yet.
No, yeah, I think when I grow up, I want to be Peter Pan. So on this show, we'll be discussing romance and superheroes and China.
And sea monsters. So stick around after the interview, and John and I will have a bit more to say about superheroes. And right now, let's get to our interview. All right, let's get Marjorie on the phone.
Hello?
Hi, this is Dave and John from Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi!
Thanks for joining us on the show. Okay, so what are some of the books that had the most influence on you growing up, and what sort of early writing did you do prior to getting published?
No, the first one that comes to mind is Little House on the Prairie. Just Laura Ingalls Wilder. I can't explain it. I read her books over and over and over again when I was growing up. I just couldn't get enough of them. There was just something about, I don't know if it was the historical aspect of them or what, but just reading about this girl that was, my age or just a little bit older, growing up, without electricity, and it really captured my imagination. And so eventually I went from, Laura Ingalls Wilder to, fairy tales, and from fairy tales to, it's a hop, skip, and a jump from Puss in Boots to dragons and sorcerers and things like that. I think I learned how to read when I was 3 or 4, and I think I learned how to write around the same time. I mean, it wasn't great writing, but I could write my name and hold a pencil and copy words and stuff. And I think I actually started writing little, 3-sentence stories or things like that when I was in preschool and kindergarten. And then, the cat was in the tree and, the cat fell out of the tree, things like that. And then I just always liked to write, and I always liked to read, and the two just seemed to go together naturally. So,
I hear a cat purring.
Cat purring. Is that disturbing? Should I kick her off my lap?
Well, you were just talking about a cat in a tree, so it kind of seems appropriate.
Right. Yeah. So I just Roxanne, let me rub your tummy. I just kept writing. I feel like I've been writing forever, and a lot of it was crap. But when you do it long enough, I guess eventually something good comes out, hopefully. I always wanted to be a writer, and in high school I wrote all kinds of, dark and twisted tales. And then I went to college, and it seemed like I started studying more nonfiction essay writing, and I would write short stories on the side and poetry. I got something published here and there, like a poem here and an essay here, but it wasn't until the end of law school when it hit me square in the face that, I was going to have to be a lawyer for the rest of my life. And I thought, I don't want to do that. So after I passed the bar and after graduation of the bar, I told myself, well, take some time and this is it. You've never taken any time off for yourself, and just write and see what happens. And I sort of put myself in a weird zone, and I wrote a book in a month. I just sat down and I did it. And I revised it and I sent it out and I sold it and I sold several others and I just decided to start writing full time.
What was the first book?
Tiger Eye. It was a paranormal romance about a metalsmith that goes to China and she's visiting Panjiaren, the dirt market, and she buys this box, and when she opens it up, this cursed 2,000-year-old warrior springs free and declares himself her servant. She can do anything she wants with him. And of course, Della, being the nice individual that she is, she says that she wants to save him. And now it's being turned into a video game, actually.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about that? What's going on with the video game, and when's it going to be out, and what type of game is it going to be? That kind of thing.
It's one of those casual games. Hidden objects, puzzles, things like that. But the difference is that it actually follows the plot of the romance novel itself. So when you're playing the game, you solve riddles that are based off of the book itself, and then you're given these cutscenes. They're actually like animated scenes from the books with voice actors and things like that. And so as you play the game, you just follow the plot of the book. You're actually experiencing the book in a game format. And it's coming out from Passion Fruit Games, passionfruitgames.com. And I believe the actual release will be in the middle of April 2010.
Okay, so you mentioned that you decided you didn't want to be a lawyer for the rest of your life. Why did you decide to go to law school in the first place? And what was it that made you decide to follow the path of the writer instead?
Well, my undergrad degree was in East Asian Studies and Biomedical Ethics. And it's not really easy to get a job with that degree. And I liked writing and I liked reading. And I thought, well, I don't know, let's try law school. Let's just keep going to school and, postpone the actual job search. And I'm a practical person in the sense I wanted something, where I felt like I could always get a job. And being a lawyer, presumably I would be able to find something, something to pay the bills with. So I went to law school, and I'm happy I did because I loved law school. I really, really had a wonderful time in law school. I loved learning about the law. I loved everything that I did there. But actually being a lawyer is a whole different thing. And I just knew my own personality, and I knew my reaction to certain situations. I just knew that if I continued on as a lawyer in 5 or 10 years, I would be a totally different person. I wouldn't be able to recognize myself. And writing was always my first love, and I thought, I had to give it a chance. I just had to try to at least get something published. Even if I practiced law for the rest of my life, even if it never panned out, I just had to try. Or I just knew I would regret it if I didn't. So, that's why I took the time off and wrote my little heart out. And luckily for me, it panned out.
Okay, so you've written 2 novel series, The Dirk and Steel and The Hunter Kiss. What are these books about, and how did you come up with the ideas?
For the Dirk and Steel series, the first book in the series is Tiger Eye, and at the time, I was just writing a story that I thought would be fun to read, and I wasn't really thinking about a series. After I started sending the book out, actually after that first novel was sold, and they asked me, could this be a series? Were you planning one? And I said, okay, sure. I'm not gonna say no. So that's really how it came about, and I'm not good at planning ahead. So the series has sort of developed. The series basically is about this detective agency called Dirk and Steel, and it sounds corny. It sounds like a 70s porn movie, and everyone in the book is aware of that, and they make fun of it. But it's just filled with psychics and creatures out of legend, and it's set in this contemporary modern world. And the whole premise of this agency is it's not so much a detective agency as it is a group of people that sort of keep each other's secrets and find ways to live in this modern world without exposing their secrets. So, and they have big adventures, and there's conspiracy and, sex and violence and all kinds of crazy stuff. But the series has evolved with each book and just sort of on its own. Like I said, I don't plan ahead. So as I write the book, different things will come out, or I'll get new ideas about, where I want to take one organization or another. And so it's just sort of after 10 or 11 books, I think it is now, it's sort of become its own thing. It's taken on a life of its own. As far as the other series goes, which is the Hunter Kiss series, it's classified as urban fantasy. The Dirk and Steel series is much more romantic. It's a paranormal romance where basically each book focuses on a new hero and heroine and follows their adventures as they fall in love. And there's, always a happy ending. All kinds of, crazy things can happen to them. You know, like I wrote one novel that was set in the Congo, where, you know, people were getting struck down with Ebola, and, you know, the hero and heroine were getting tortured, and all kinds of crazy stuff, you know, human experimentation, just everything. But there was a happy ending, so it's all good.
So you're like, love is in the air. Oh wait, no, that's
love
Ebola.
Is in the air, yeah. But the Hunter Kiss series it's much darker, and it's a continuing series. It's basically about a woman who's covered in living tattoos, and they peel off her body at night to form her own demonic army. It is a fantasy, but it also deals with, for example, the demons that are imprisoned around the earth are actually they're more like aliens from another world that came to Earth via this sort of interdimensional pathway that I call the labyrinth. And they did battle with these other alien creatures that are their energy, and they can manipulate human flesh, you know, to make, you know, monsters or to give themselves powers. And so these energy-based beings, they inhabit human bodies, and they did battle with these quote demons that they imprisoned. And then these energy-based beings made wardens, which the heroine Maxine is one of those wardens, in order to sort of, you know, guard this veil and keep these demons from escaping. But that was, you know, that giant battle was 10,000 years ago, and now 10,000 years have passed, and it's modern day, and the veil is breaking down, and Maxine is the only warden left, and she's developed powers beyond what those original energy-based beings, you know, anticipated, and now she's a threat to them as well. It's kind of convoluted, but it's been really fun to write.
So you mentioned that the protagonist is covered with tattoos. Do you have any tattoos yourself?
No, I don't. I love looking at tattoos, but for me personally, I get tired of things. I just, you know, if I gave myself a tattoo, even if it was one that I desperately wanted, probably about a week or two later, you know, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but, you know, after a short amount of time, I'd be very tired of it, and I'd want something new, and just, and also I don't think tattoos age that well. You know, if you think about it, if you get a tattoo, you know, when you're young, your skin's firm, you know, you're looking good, you're looking, what, 30, 40 years?
You can tell that you write romance.
Huh? Yeah.
So as an undergrad, well, you mentioned that you majored in East Asian languages and cultures, and you also minored in biomedical ethics. Have you been able to use any of that knowledge, or even your legal studies, in your writing?
A lot of my books do deal with themes of genetic engineering and the misuse of science and things like that. I was always interested in those things before I got my degree, so it's probably just a continuation of that. As far as East Asian influence goes, I do spend a lot of time, besides the fact I have a degree in East Asian studies, I spend a lot of time in China. And it seems like when I start looking back on the books I've written, I would say, you know, there's been about 3 or 4 that have been set in Asia. Yeah, there's an influence. Like I said, I don't think about it very often, but yeah, it's there.
Have you had any interesting experiences in China that you could tell us about?
If you asked me to tell you like one crazy story of, you know, something, you know, strange that happened, it'd be hard for me to think of one, because actually, this is what I tell people about, you know, writing fantasies in a contemporary urban setting. In a way, it's not that difficult, and not because I'm writing about things I'm familiar with, but because the world is so strange. You know, truth really is stranger than fiction. For example, when you go to Beijing, it's a very urban environment. And on the surface of it, you can look at the skyscrapers and you can, you know, look at all the freeways and the cars and you say, you know, like, I understand this. But then you go a little deeper and you walk down into the hutongs, or you go to the Forbidden City, or in the markets where the locals go, or just whatever. You take a walk, you take a drive into the hills, you know, near the Great Wall. You see things that are, in a way, they're not, I mean, of course they're not unusual to the people who live there, but because you're not used to them, they're unusual to you. And it makes you look at the world just a little bit differently. It's good for the imagination. It's good for, you know, all those creative juices.
What's the fantasy and science fiction writing scene in China like?
I haven't really interacted that much with many of the writers over there because I don't really know where they are. I mean, I've tried to find them. What I've been told is that the readership is huge in China for science fiction. And I know when I go to the bookstores, like the Gong Fu novels, like the Sword, you know, the historical novels, the most popular novels, I think, in China are the ones featuring magic and sword fighting, and they're kind of sometimes based on historical figures, but they're hugely popular. I mean, and when you see the movies that are coming out in China, even historical movies, there's, a fantasy bent to them.
I had a roommate who was from China, and he asked me, I showed him like a Realms of Fantasy magazine that I was in, and he said, how many people read this? And I said, I don't know, I think, sort of 15 to 20,000. And he was like, oh, in China, the magazine would have over 1 million people reading it.
Yeah, that's probably true. Every bookstore I've been to in China, they're like giant warehouses. They're in the middle of the city. They're 6 or 7 stories high. They're massive places, and they're packed. They're just packed with people, just, standing in the aisles reading, browsing and reading. And, you can look at the books and you'll see places where little pages were marked because, people will come to the bookstore to read and then they'll mark their place and then come back later. You see in cinema a lot of fantasy movies. I haven't seen so much science fiction, Chinese science fiction movies, but you see a lot of Chinese fantasy movies.
Well, actually, speaking of science fiction, I was just reading that China is putting in the first of a sort of high-tech levitating train, and that China's actually ahead of us, really, in technology. I mean, does it feel at all like science fiction when you travel in China?
It feels like a combination of science fiction and fantasy, just because everyone has a cell phone. It doesn't matter if you are in the most remote village on the outskirts of Mongolia. Everyone there has a cell phone. Or a satellite dish, they're watching TV and their cell phone technology in China is a lot more advanced than what we've got here.
You mentioned in an interview, I think, the Shanghai skyline as being really impressive.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It feels a little Blade Runner-ish sometimes when you're in Shanghai and you see the skyline, and then you're walking and it's raining and the skyline's beautiful, and then you see the little food carts and the little markets where people are selling fruit and seafood and things like that. The one thing about Shanghai and Beijing is that there's a very organic feel to both the technology that you see there and the melding of technology and the way people live. Because the technology is everywhere. But at the same time, you can walk into a hutong in Beijing, there's a skyscraper, you can see the skyscrapers, but then you're walking into a hutong in Beijing, which is just, a collection of alleys and courtyard homes. You feel like you've been transported, 50 to 100 years in the past. But at the same time, it works. It seems to fit together so seamlessly.
Okay, shifting gears a bit back towards fiction stuff. You created a fan fiction website called WolverineandJubilee.com.
No one's asked me about that for years.
So what was your experience like that? What was your experience writing fan fiction, and is that something you'd recommend to aspiring authors, or?
I know some people get mad at me when I say this, but I do. Before I started writing fan fiction, I'd always had trouble finishing short stories and just actually finishing, the first novel I ever finished from beginning to end was Tiger Eye. But, as far as short stories went and things like that, I never could finish them until I started writing fan fiction. And there was no pressure. I think that's the wonderful thing about it is there's no pressure. You take these characters and you can run with them and you just basically are writing for yourself. And it's fun and it gives you good practice and as far as plot, because even with fan fiction, the really good fan fiction has great plot, great character work, great dialogue, all of that. It's a really good way to practice those basic skills. And I know that some people complain about you're stealing other people's work, but you're not being paid for it. As a former fan fiction writer, I feel like saying lighten up a little bit.
And so you sort of graduated, right, from the WolverineandJubilee.com to you actually are getting paid for it now. You're writing for Marvel Comics.
Actually, it's strange because I never actually dreamed that I would be writing for Marvel. I wrote fan fiction, and then I stopped writing fan fiction when I started working on my more, original work, and then I wrote my novel. Yeah, I mean, I wrote Tiger Eye, then I went to Clarion. I haven't written fan fiction in years. But what happened was that at my first World Fantasy in Tucson, I met my agent, Lucienne Diver, and we were talking, and it was Halloween. Her son ran up, and he was wearing this really adorable Spider-Man costume. And I said, oh, he's so cute. I said, oh, I love Marvel. I love, the X-Men, all that. And she said, well, I happen to know an editor who's, acquiring prose writers for Marvel. They just signed a licensing deal with Pocket. And, maybe you should submit a proposal. And I think at the time the Spider-Man movie was coming out or close to coming out, so everyone was after telling a Spider-Man tale, but no one had asked to do the X-Men. And of course, the X-Men are my first love, so I submitted a proposal, and Jen Heddle at Pocket liked it, and Marvel liked it, and so I wrote a book for them, Dark Mirror, and it was the first X-Men book that came out in that particular line, and that was my foot in the door at Marvel, because they liked the work, and they liked the characterization, and I introduced myself to their recruitment guy at New York Comic Con, and I said, well, I'm sure you have tons and tons of writers, but if you're ever looking for anyone, here I am. And it took 3 years of sort of going back and forth, but eventually they gave me a miniseries, NYX, about homeless mutant kids living in New York City. And that was 6 issues, and I worked on that, and things sort of kept falling my way. They liked the work I did on NYX, and so John Barber and Daniel Way asked if I wanted to work on Dark Wolverine. So I said, sure. And then I did that, and now I'm doing more work for Marvel. Actually, some I can't talk about yet, but it's just been a wonderful experience. And it was totally, totally unexpected. Dream come true, but totally unexpected.
So you mentioned that you went to the Clarion Writers Workshop. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was Clarion East at East Lansing, Michigan. I actually found out that I had sold my book the second week I was there, which was really interesting. But actually, there was so much work to do just writing short stories that I held that news in my heart. I tucked it away, but basically I just got back to work. But it was 6 weeks of just this. It was an amazing 6 weeks, and it was an amazing group of people. And we were all there to write and to work on our craft, and we had wonderful, wonderful teachers. I just can't say enough good things about it. I'm kind of sad they're not in Michigan anymore, that they went out to California. But there was something about living in that sorority house that was just nuts. But it was, I don't know, I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to go. I say go if you can do it. It's good training in a lot of different ways. It's good training not just for the writing, but it's good training also because if you don't already have a thick skin before you go to Clarion, hopefully you will develop one by the end of it, because to be a professional writer, you have to have a very thick skin. And there's something about sitting in a critique circle every day or every other day and having people comment on your work, sometimes brutally, that is good for you as a writer. It's good training because people, if you continue to do it professionally, will not always be as nice, but at least it'll be something that you've experienced before. But no, it was wonderful. It was really, really wonderful.
So did you ever tell your classmates that you had sold this book while you were there?
Oh, yeah, I couldn't help it. And then after that, I just kept my mouth shut.
Who are some of your favorite authors currently?
I'm a huge fan of Kelly Link. Huge fan of Sarah Donati, who writes historical fiction. She wrote the novel Into the Wilderness, which I thought was just wonderful. As far as the romantic genre goes, I love Liz Carlisle. I love Lynn Kurland, Suzanne Brockman, Lynn Vale. As far as fantasy goes, I really love the latest installment of, was it Brandon Sanderson who wrote the last Robert Jordan book along with, using Robert Jordan's notes and yeah, actually, I really enjoyed that book. And I had kind of gone away from the series. I had read the first novel, Eye of the World, when I was in high school. And I remember all of my friends, we just went nuts over that series. We just ate it up. Robert Jordan was giving a signing in Seattle. And we went, and we only brought one book because we hated that we were trying to be polite. And we went to this Will Walden book in the mall, and he was sitting there, and there wasn't anyone else there. And we were so shy and so in awe of him, we didn't dare talk to him. But afterwards, we regretted it because he was so nice, and we wish we had the courage to actually, engage with him and ask him questions and actually bring more books for him to sign. See here. Who else? Maybe I should take the computer upstairs to take a look. What were you going to say?
I was saying, maybe you have a favorite anthologist you'd like to mention. I mean, I don't know if you...
Well, John, you're so special. I love you to pieces. You're my favorite forever and ever and ever. You and Lou Anders.
What? So what are you working on now, and what do you have coming out soon?
Oh boy. Right now I'm working on the third Hunter Kiss novel, which is called A Wild Life, and that comes out in August 2010. And let's see here. I've got a story coming out with Lou Anderson, an anthology called. Sorry, Don. But you have one of my stories. When's that anthology coming out, by the way?
It's not scheduled yet, so probably in 2011.
Okay. But the anthology with Lou is called With Great Power, and that's coming out in July, I think. I have another anthology, another story coming out in an anthology with George R. Martin called Songs of Blood and Love, or Songs of Love and Death, or something like that. I can't remember. Originally it was called Star-Crossed Lovers, but I think the marketing department thought that sounded too foo-foo, so they changed the title. I have a novel, another romance novel called Stars Below. It's a Dirk and Steele novel, and that one I think is coming out in June, but that could change. And that's sort of a merman. It's a merman pirate sea monster romance. Not the merman's not having a romance with the sea monster, but it's just in it.
That would be a little weird.
It would be a little bit weird, but I'm sure there are some people who would find it fascinating.
It would be totally hot. It would be totally hot, but weird. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And then just all kinds of comic books. Every month there's going to be a comic book coming out. Oddly enough, I wrote a Wolverine Jubilee story, a short comic book story that's coming out in an all-female anthology. I think that one's coming out in March or April for Marvel.
I guess could you talk about the Dark Wolverine? I don't know if you really.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you want to know about it?
Why is he so dark?
Dark.
Does it take place at night? I mean, I just don't know anything about it.
He's got daddy issues. I don't have any control over the titles or marketing. Basically, Wolverine is his father. Okay. Wolverine had this thing with this Japanese woman 65 years ago, and she bore a son, Falcon, that Wolverine didn't know about. And at some point, Falcon's mother is killed. Some group, assassin group, Romulus, these guys, they come and they train him and turn him into this, killing machine. And then he finds out, or he thinks that Wolverine killed his mother. Wolverine didn't, but that's what he thinks. And so he has all these daddy issues. He's a psychopath. He's really messed up. He loves to manipulate people. He has no conscience whatsoever. His only focus is attaining power. And he will do anything to further his goals in that regard. He's very dangerous. He's just mean as hell. But there's also this sense that he's evolving in the way that he views the world. And he's out in the world now. Before he was sort of living in the shadows, just sort of doing his own thing. And now he's out in the world and he's being tested in ways that he hadn't before. And so he's still not a good person by any stretch of the imagination. He won't be for, a while yet. But there's this germ of a possibility that one day he could be a hero, like his father. And so it's very interesting playing with that character and playing with those possibilities, even if everything he's done up until now has been, pretty nasty.
So who would win in a fight between Wolverine and Spider-Man?
I don't know. I think they would both do very well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm leaning towards Spider-Man, actually, just because he could immobilize, Wolverine. Hopefully. I think he could, and then he'd get away really fast. But Wolverine is a man of infinite patience. So I think eventually in the long term, probably he would end up getting Spider-Man, but it would take a little bit of planning.
What superhero would you most like to find yourself trapped in a romance novel with?
Oh gosh. Superman or Batman. Or Wolverine. Maybe Gambit.
and a sea serpent.
And a merman. And a shapeshifter.
What are your cats' names?
One sitting beside me right now is Roxanne. I call them, they're the 5-cat death squad because they're so efficient at killing mice. Although they haven't had to kill mice lately because they're in a new house. But in the old farmhouse, it was just blood and guts everywhere. It was wonderful. But there's Roxanne, and there's Petula, and Persimmon, and Zucchini Puccini, and Lilac. Am I forgetting anyone? No, I don't think so. And then, of course, there's Daisy the poodle, who rides around a lot on my back.
I think that's all. That's everything we ever wanted to know.
Probably more than
perhaps
you wanted
more,
to know.
Yeah, perhaps more.
I remember there was my author photo for the romance novels actually shows the little dog backpack and, Daisy in the backpack. But for Tiger Eye, I thought I was being funny. And actually, I think my bio may still be the same. I'm not sure. But for that novel, I was joking around and I gave my credentials. But then I said at the end, she also runs a taxi service for poodles. And I was like, ha ha ha. Well, they didn't put the picture with the bio in that book. And so what happened was I was getting emails from people, actually deadly serious emails, asking me what it's like to run a taxi service.
No, I saw that on your FAQ, and I was like, what is that all about?
Yeah. No, people really send me emails, and they were genuinely curious about what that's like. And I said, I'm sorry. It's just, I was just joking. And they were like, okay. Actually, no, I can't really imagine running a business like that. Although with poodles, no, okay, let's not go there. Anyway.
Okay, well, Marjorie M. Liu, thank you very much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thank you.
And that was our interview.
Hey, that's my line.
Huh. You always say it.
All right, I'll let you say it just this once. So now let's talk a little bit about comics. So I've been thinking about this, and I was never like a huge superhero comic book reader growing up, and I was trying to think about why that was, because given all my other interests, you would think it was the kind of thing that I would be drawn to, and I did really like. When we were kids, there was this cartoon Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and I really liked that. And this one time I caught this X-Men cartoon that I really liked. But the problem with that is that, sometimes stuff is on TV and then you don't know when it's on. And, I never saw it again until years later. If someone can tell, it was great though. There was, it had Nightcrawler, and all the heroes were on a sort of spaceship, and it was going to blow up, and he had to grab 2 power cables and use his body as a conduit for all the energy to keep the ship from blowing up. And then he was looking at a video monitor where their other ship that they were escaping onto was, and so he was going to teleport onto it at the last moment. And then the ship blows up, and everybody's like, hey, where's Nightcrawler? I guess he's dead. But then he kind of stumbles out of a closet, and he's got smoke coming off of him. And I was like, this is great, but then I never caught the show again. So if anyone can tell me what episode that was, I'd actually be curious to see it. But I don't know. Were you like big into superhero comics growing up?
Well, not growing up so much as when when I was about 18 or so, or maybe a year or two younger than that. My sister got married, and her husband was heavy into comics, and so when I was hanging out with them at some point, they sort of got me hooked on Spider-Man was the first one that I started reading. I obsessively read superhero comics for several years, and at some point I kind of had to give them up because I had to make a decision if I was going to spend my money on books or comic books, because I was spending so much of my income on those two things. Like, I couldn't continue to do both. I had to, it came to the point where I just had to make a decision, and I chose books. So I sort of stopped reading superhero comics for a long time. And, I've since gotten back into reading comics a bit, but I haven't dove back into superhero comics, because that way lies madness to some degree, because there are so many superhero comics and they're all sort of interrelated. So, like, you have something set in the Marvel universe, you get these crossovers. And so, like, if you're reading Spider-Man, you start to kind of wonder, well, what are these other guys doing? And or something like the Avengers is even worse, where, it's like a super team. I haven't been able to dare to, dip my toe back in those waters since then, because, I just don't have the time. I mean, at least now I could actually afford it, but I don't have the time to read them all.
Well, no, I mean, the expense is definitely a factor, especially since you can kind of read a comic book so quickly. Sometimes friends of mine would have comics, and I would read them, and I would just get frustrated because I would read the whole thing in 8 minutes, and then I would want to know what happened next, and, you would have to try to find the next issue. But another thing is, it seems like thinking back, I can't even remember where I would have bought a comic book that was just, available to me. I mean, I'm sure I could have had my parents drive me to a comic book store if I was really motivated. But, I spent most of my time in bookstores. And when we were kids, bookstores didn't really carry comic books, so I would read, like, The Far Side and Calvin and Hobbes and Bloom County and sort of stuff like that was in bookstores, but they didn't have superhero comics.
Oh, some of them did. I mean, I during my comic book heyday, I was actually working at a Walden Books, and that Walden Books did have a little spinner rack of comics. I mean, not a great selection or anything, but that it was sort of like the drug pusher on the corner, just sort of tempting you into reading, just read a few, just read one. Look, you work at the store, you could just borrow this, you could just look at this one on your lunch break, and then so it was my sampler rack, and then and then I sort of wanted to read all these other ones like I was just talking about, and so that got me into going to the comic book store. And once you get to the comic book store, it's all over, because they'll say, hey, if you want to pick up those titles every time, just let me know which ones you want. I'll keep them back here behind the counter for you, so you don't have to worry about missing out on any issues. Your pile gets bigger and bigger as time goes on, and you don't realize that you're spending half your paycheck every week on comic books. And
But you mentioned these spinner racks, and I mean, I kind of have this mental image of comic books on a spinner rack as sort of a classic thing, but like thinking about my actual childhood, I don't really remember coming across those particularly. And you would think, I think a generation or two before, when millions of people were reading comic books, that comic books, these spinner racks were at drugstores and whatever, and you couldn't help run across them, and I feel like they've sort of disappeared. And I was thinking it's sort of the same thing as with the short fiction magazines. That last week we were talking about Isaac Asimov, and he worked at his parents' candy store growing up, which is how he got into reading the science fiction magazines, because they carried them in the candy store. And if I don't really ever go to a candy store, but if I were to go to one, I wouldn't imagine that they would be carrying science fiction magazines in them. And so it does seem like there's sort of this barrier to entry, because you really have to get to the comic book store to really get into the comic books, and if you don't make that first step, they're just sort of not in front of you,
Right. Well, I mean, at least there was that barrier when we were kids. I mean, nowadays every bookstore has a huge section devoted to graphic novels, which is sort of collected issues worth of comics. And so it's a lot easier to get into them these days. And also there's the internet, which will sort of, the marketing of the internet allows people to get exposed to comics in a way that they weren't, exposed to beforehand. But I was going to say about the, disappearance of the spinner racks. I grew up mostly in Florida, and so I wonder if that was sort of a regional difference, where you grew up in New York, maybe they just didn't, they had already disappeared, but down in Florida, maybe they were still around, because, the bookstore I worked at had them. And then also, I know I definitely had gone into like a Walgreens or something, and they had one there. There weren't like a lot of mom and pop type shops down where I lived in Florida. So, I mean, I couldn't say if, your local drugstore or whatever would have a spinner rack, but, something like a big chain like Walgreens used to have them. The incidental, exposure to comics was probably, harder to come by than it is today, certainly.
I mean, when I was sort of in high school, I think they actually did open up a comic book store in my town, that I could walk to. And but at that point, I was really more into the role-playing games, and so I would go over there every day, and check out what role-playing game stuff they had. And even it was a comic book store, so I imagine they must have had comic books. But even in my mind, they must have had them, mostly behind the counter or something. I guess maybe so kids wouldn't steal them or mess them up or something. But it was really great for me having that store, though, because it was like where I discovered Dragon Magazine, which was the first magazine I submitted fiction to, and I picked up a lot of great stuff there, but I was always the only person in there, and so sometimes I would just go in and and just buy stuff. I didn't really even need like more dice or something, just because I wanted the store to stick around. But you always knew it was doomed, and it disappeared pretty quickly.
It's funny. I always wondered about stores like that, because you see a comic book store and you would think that, oh, well, the comic book store, it would make sense if they have role-playing games as well. Or it would make sense if they had, some science fiction paperbacks or something as well. But it's not necessarily true. A lot of comic book stores only sold comic books, or else they sold comic books in collectible card games or like baseball cards, which doesn't seem like the same market at all to me. But, I was always surprised that they were very specific in what they were focused on, because it seemed like, if there was a store that had, both science fiction books and comic books and role-playing game books, I mean, it's like, where else would I need to shop?
Well, Marjorie was talking about people in China marking the books that they're reading and then just going back to the store over and over and reading the books there. And I confess I do that sometimes with comic books or with the graphic novels, because you can read them so fast that and they cost so much that I'm kind of like, well, I could just stand here and read this whole thing. Why do I want to pay money and take it home? And I'm probably not going to read it more than once unless it's something really amazing. And and when you go to the bookstores, whenever you go to the graphic novel section, there's just like a dozen kids just sitting there reading the comic books. And I used to look at those kids and say, "Oh, you cheapskates!" And now I've sort of turned into one of them. I wish that there was just some sort of legitimate way to do that. That it would be nice if you could just pay, a few bucks an hour or something to just sit there and read the comic books and not feel guilty about it.
I mean, we've been talking about the ways in which people get exposed to comic books, and I mean, we haven't mentioned the most obvious way these days, I guess, which is all the superhero movies that are being made these days. Like Spider-Man and X-Men and Batman and all these superhero movies that they're these huge blockbuster events where, like, for years, I mean, there was nothing. I mean, you had like Superman, and that was almost it. It's like that was like the only legitimate superhero movie out there. And then now it's like, superheroes are big business. I mean, you've got Comic-Con and, there's the San Diego Comic-Con, which is the original one. And then you've got like the New York Comic-Con, which is like growing to be very large as well. And so you have these huge major conventions that are just all revolving around superheroes to some degree. I mean, it's either the superheroes coming out in the movies or just in the comic books themselves. So, that's reaching, the current generation. That's the way they're getting hooked on comics, is probably through exposure from the movies.
Actually, on the subject of the movies, I had something I wanted a plea to people who make comic book movies, is that sometimes they just put in these jokes that just, for me, really break the suspension of disbelief. And I wish they would stop doing that. Like, an example is in the first X-Men movie. They've put on their costumes, and their costumes don't really look like the costumes in the comic book. They're just black in the movie, and Wolverine says, "You guys actually go out in these things?" And Cyclops says, "Well, what would you prefer, yellow spandex?" And that line just drives me crazy, because the only reason it's funny is because for a moment you stop believing that any of this is real, and you're thinking about how this is an adaptation of a comic book. And I take my superhero movies seriously, and I don't like those little moments of making fun of the whole enterprise.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, because, the thing is, if they had cut that part of the line out and just had Wolverine say, "You guys go out in these things," it might actually be kind of funny to the same audience anyway, because, you're probably sitting there watching it thinking, "Hey, those uniforms look awesome," and you're thinking in your mind of how they look in the comic book, and it's like, oh, they're complaining about that, but that's actually a huge improvement.
Yeah, well, as long as I like the joke, I mean, I don't mind if a joke sort of plays to the comic book readers, as long as it also works within the context of the reality of the movie story,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Like in X-Men 2, they did kind of another thing like that, where in X-Men 2, there's a really overt parallel drawn between the plight of the mutants in the X-Men universe and the plight of gays in America,
mm-hmm.
which, for the most part, I really like. I thought it gave the movie sort of a sincerity and seriousness that I thought was really good. But there's a scene where Bobby Drake basically comes out to his parents as a mutant, which I thought was great. But then his mom says, "Have you tried not being a mutant?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's like it doesn't make sense within the context of this story. It's like a joke that depends upon you thinking for a moment none of this stuff is real,
Mm-hmm.
And so if just to plea to movie makers, those jokes aren't worth it.
Well, I mean, if we're going to start making pleas to movie makers, we could probably come up with a pretty long list of things we can ask them not to do when making superhero movies.
Yeah. Well, so maybe we should move on then.
Well, maybe we'll leave it up to our listeners to, tell us that in the feedback on the blog.
But you were talking about how people get exposed to comic books, and when I was a kid, there was something I thought was really cool. As I was out on Halloween one night, and there was this guy. I don't know. I remember him as being sort of a cool younger guy, and he, instead of giving out candy for Halloween, he was giving out comic books. And he just had these big, I don't know where he got them, just these big pallets of comic books, and he was just giving them out. And whatever adult I was with asked him about this, and he just said, I just thought, these kids don't need to eat any more candy, which is certainly true, and it's just a good way to, maybe get them into reading instead.
That's very cool.
The comic book actually he gave me, I remember it really vividly. I unfortunately don't remember the name. It wasn't a major thing, I don't think. But I just, he just gave me this comic book, and I was kind of like, okay. And then I ended up reading it over and over and over again. And there was a moment in it I've always really liked where there's an evil guy from another dimension who's planning to take over Earth. And he asks his sexy assistant, what time is it now in London or whatever? And she tells him. And she says, you still haven't gotten the hang of time zones, have you? And he says, a barbaric concept. When I rule this world, they'll be abolished. And I always just really liked that moment. I wonder if maybe he could get us on the metric system while he's at sort of an evil overlord. It's just about the only way you can imagine some sensible reform like that taking place.
I'm right with that guy, though. I can't manage time zones. I need a sexy assistant to also tell me what time it is in London, because if I'm expected to have a meeting with someone in London, I am not going to be on time. Oh, but what you were saying kind of reminded me of an event from my childhood, which involved superheroes. I vividly remember a time when, I must have been 5 years old or younger, when there was a guy dressed up as Spider-Man who was at the mall or something, and he was there so that, kids could go get their picture taken with him and so forth. And I know my parents took me down there to see him because apparently I loved Spider-Man, and he just scared the crap out of me. I just wept like, somebody had just killed my puppy. And there's a picture of me like sitting on Spider-Man's lap, just bawling my eyes out.
When I lived in L.A. for a while, I lived just off of Hollywood Boulevard, and in front of Mann's Chinese Theater, where they have sort of premieres. There are all these people dressed up as superheroes who just hang out there, and they want you to give them like $1 to have your picture taken with them. And there's actually a really interesting documentary called, I think, Confessions of a Superhero, where they interview some of these people. And there's this guy and I saw this guy, the guy who dresses up as Superman, and he's just obsessed with Superman. And they go to his apartment, and literally the whole wall, every floor, every horizontal surface is just covered with some sort of Superman paraphernalia. And this guy, he's just living in kind of this dingy apartment, and he says that he estimates that he has over $1 million worth of Superman memorabilia, but he won't sell it, because it's that important to him. But sort of another kind of experience I had that got me more interested in comics is when I was living in Austin, Texas, I went to the Texas Book Fair, and they had a panel on science fiction that I wanted to see, and so I went to that, and I was kind of disappointed. And in the same room, in the next hour, was a thing on comics, and I was like, I'll stick around for that. Why not? And the guys who showed up were Terry Moore. I didn't know who they were at the time, but it was Terry Moore, who does The Strangers in Paradise, and Shannon Wheeler, who does Too Much Coffee Man. And it was just they were so good. They were so thoughtful and articulate and interesting, and they just kept me riveted for this whole hour. And so of course I went right home and ordered their graphic novels. And then I had another sort of experience kind of like that I think it was at Lunacon, a sort of New York area science fiction convention, but they had a panel on comic books. And I sort of remembered going to this really interesting panel at the book fair, so I went to this one. And it was just fascinating. They had just the most interesting discussions. And the thing that sticks with me the most is somebody in the audience asked, how does Superman justify taking any time off, right? How does he justify spending any time as Clark Kent or going on a date with Lois Lane when somewhere somebody's falling off a bridge or, needs his help? And I was kind of like, yeah, that's an interesting question. And the guy said something I thought was so interesting. He said, surely you're not spending as much time as is humanly possible helping other people, right? You could be volunteering at a soup kitchen or working an extra job to give money to charity or whatever. So what's your excuse for spending any time on yourself? And I've just thought about that so much since, and just the construct of a superhero, it just leads to so many interesting thoughts about what are your obligations to other people.
And so you took away from that discussion that, there's no way I could possibly spend as much time as necessary in thinking about other people, so I'll just think about myself all the time. Is that right?
I realized that really I had to devote my life to helping humanity by doing a podcast.
Right.
So
I think we're doing a good job. We're definitely helping people.
I expect world peace somewhere around episode 15. So.
15, really? Okay. I was thinking maybe
you think that's
25.
Pessimistic? Yeah. Oh, you think?
No. I was thinking 25. It's going to take longer. The world's pretty messed up, man.
So you and I went to this exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Superheroes, Fashion and Fantasy, and so they had kind of lectures on superheroes, and then they had fashion inspired by superhero costumes, and you could see some of the costumes that had been used in the movies, like they had Iron Man and the Batman costume and stuff. I think you were saying that, you could tell pretty much who was there because of their interest in fashion and who was there because of their interest in superhero comics. And probably a lot of people assumed that we were there because we just look like supermodels or something.
Yeah.
But it was sort of two kind of worlds probably that don't come together that often. And they had some of the panels had kind of funny titles like E Pluribus Unitard. There was the guy who, he was a costume designer for movies, and he was talking about when you look at comic books, the costumes are basically just the human form with color added, and that it's really hard to translate a superhero costume into reality because you're kind of like, well, what material actually is this made of? Because superhero costumes, they seem to be made out of this infinitely thin, infinitely flexible material, and, is this denim? And so a lot of times you see characters translated to the screen, and you're just kind of like, that's not the kind of material I imagine the costume being made out of at all.
Yeah, if you look at Spider-Man's costume in the Spider-Man movies, which actually looks pretty good, but how could he possibly breathe through that?
Or see, really.
Yeah, really.
Go ahead.
But I was gonna say about costumes. My favorite superhero probably actually doesn't even wear a costume. Silver Surfer. He's just silver and metallic and stuff, and he's the most improbably cool superhero that there is. If you say the Silver Surfer, it sounds like the stupidest idea ever. Hey, a guy who rides around the cosmos on a surfboard. It's like, and he's an alien, so it doesn't even make sense. Like, why? So I guess on this other alien planet, they also have surfboards that look just like our surfboards,
And then the origin of the character, I think, is that at Marvel they were just like, hey, surfing's really popular. We should have a character who surfs. And how just something so powerful can come out of something just such a kind of random.
Right.
One of the recent graphic novels, it's not superheroes, but that we've really enjoyed was Robert Kirkman's Walking Dead, which is just fantastic. And so I was at Kirkman's website, and he has kind of this video of him just talking about kind of the state of the comic book industry. And he says that it's not a good trend that so many of the best writers are writing these like famous superheroes and doing really adult, sophisticated stories with them. And that's cool, but that he wishes all these really good writers were doing their own things, and that all of these classic characters were kept as more like gateway characters for younger, for kids that they could find and get into it.
If you take something like Captain America and make it like super sophisticated and challenging, then yeah, what are the kids going to read? I could picture my nephew whose stepdad is like, in the military, like. He would totally be the market for Captain America, but it depends on what they're currently doing with it. The Captain America I remember when I was reading it, yeah, that would be fine. But if you have one of these reinventions going on with it, who knows if he would even really connect with it at all. Oh, so on the subject of superheroes, I can't have a superhero discussion without talking about The Tick. The Tick is one of these parodies of superheroes that sort of requires a lot of familiarity with the long legacy of superheroes to really get the most enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, I've never seen The Tick, but I was earlier mentioning Shannon Wheeler's Too Much Coffee Man, and I think it's a similar sort of thing where it's kind of a cynical look at superheroes in a way. And Too Much Coffee Man, he's just kind of this sort of fat, out of shape guy, and he has a big coffee cup for a forehead. But so, Too Much Coffee Man never really goes on any adventures or anything, or at least you don't see them. He just kind of sits around his apartment moping and drinking too much coffee and having weird philosophical conversations with himself. The cover says, if you like your coffee and your comics dark, this is the one for you.
Mm-hmm. There's a comic called Powers that actually it's sort of another postmodern sort of superhero comic. In that comic, there's a detective unit that specializes in like crimes related to superpowered individuals, because there's only like a few superheroes around, but they need a special unit just devoted to all the crimes that surround superheroes fighting crime, because there's people will get killed by accident by superheroes, and then a superhero gets murdered, and so it's up to somebody to figure out who did it. But it's a really interesting exploration of superheroes from like a different point of view.
Well, it almost seems like, just when I'm thinking about things I've seen over the last couple of years, that there's almost more cynical takes on superheroes than there are, old-fashioned, straightforward, fun takes on superheroes. I mean, like Watchmen is like that, and Wanted is kind of like that, and The Incredibles is kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I had another example just a second ago.
George Martin's Wild Cards, or
oh, that's a good example. The Superman Returns,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was like that too. The Dark Knight is a little bit like that, I guess. I mean, can you think of anything that's just has a superhero who's just totally good and noble and doesn't have any dark side at all?
Well, I mean, I think they kind of did away with that at some point. I mean, like Captain America used to be like that, I think. And they, at some point, the writers and everybody just sort of decided that, well, this is all kind of still too silly to have anybody pure good, and so they sort of tried to put some darker shading into their characters to, make them more realistic. But I mean, there's certainly a lot of cynicism that's crept in. So when you mentioned Superman Returns, that reminded me of before Brandon Routh got cast as Superman, one of the rumors was Nicolas Cage was going to be Superman. And I mean, can you imagine a worse casting decision than that?
Yeah, but I mean, if you go on Wikipedia and read what the production was like for that movie, it's amazing that it turned out as good as it did. I mean, it could have been much, much, much worse. I mean, you just read all the just weird ideas that were in at different points. And it's kind of the same thing with the Watchmen movie. I mean, if people are unhappy with the Watchmen movie, the way it came out, I mean, just go and read what it could have had. I mean, you could have had Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dr. Manhattan. I mean, so maybe we should just be thankful for small blessings. And that was our show. Thanks everyone for joining us. And be sure to join us next week when we interview Brian Dunning of Skeptoid, one of the internet's most popular science podcasts. See you then.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Tor.com. For this episode's show notes or to subscribe to this podcast, visit Tor.com and click on Podcasts. For more information about your hosts, visit JohnJosephAdams.com or DavidBarrCurrently.com. Music and voiceover produced by Deadstill 9 Entertainment. If you've enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.